Suffer in Heaven by Chelsea Grin. This is the Salt Lake City, Utah outfit's 7th studio album, released March 17th via 1RPM Records. Suffer in Heaven consists of 8 tracks, clocks in at around 27 minutes, and is sort of the second half to this double album split as 2 separate releases that kicked off last year with Suffer in Hell. So, I mean, I called this the 7th album. I don't know if it technically means it's the 8th here, but if you take this as Suffer in Hell, Suffer in Heaven, then I think, yes, this is their 7th studio album. This is the second part to that experience. We finally have it. We finally heard it. Sam, was it worth the wait?
I'm kind of coming in at this really hot. Like, I really think that this might be my favorite Chelsea Grin album, period.
So my question is, so the way that it's presented, do you mean these 8 songs, or do you mean the totality of this Suffer in Hell, Suffer in Heaven double album experience?
These 8 songs, honestly, I look at these as 2 separate albums. Like, had they released as one cohesive double album, that'd be one thing. But the fact that they got them out, I was able to consume one, and now separately I'm able to consume the other. I look at them as 2 different albums that are tied together with like a theme, right?
Yeah.
So for
Suffering, clearly.
I think Suffer in Heaven might be one of Chelsea Grin's best albums. And I also think that it's better than its predecessor or its first half, right? Suffer in Hell.
Interesting. So I've heard this album a number of times. I don't know if I'm fully aligned with you because when Suffer in Hell dropped, I really, really liked it. And I think right now I might be slightly more partial to it. But all that is to say that I think that this double album is really solid when you factor in both parts.
So you're saying like successful experiment and just in terms of like release structure?
I don't think, and you might disagree, I guess, but I really don't think that one part overshadows the other, which is also, part of the risk you take splitting it in such an unconventional way. There could have been an opportunity where that first part lands and it's everyone's AO2Y and it's the craziest thing they've ever heard, depending on how they mixed up the track listings, and then this one drops and it falls flat and it's a dud, right? But I don't think either really happened, but in a good way. Like, I think Chelsea Grin just gave us 2 really great offerings, and as a Chelsea Grin fan who's been waiting a very long time, Eternal Nightmare dropped 2018, Sam. It's been a hot minute. 5 years later, and we finally have, I think, 16 or 15 total new songs from this band. And I'm sitting here just like, hey, CG gang, we up, we eating. I'm happy.
But that
undersells your feelings.
That's in terms of an overall feeling about this band and where they stand currently. It's like, okay, yeah. Chelsea Grin feels like they're in a really good spot. This is a strong album.
But more specific to this album, let's get into those feelings.
Yeah, well, essentially what I want to say is that I kind of align with you, right? It's like, as Chelsea Grin fans, it feels like our patience has been rewarded.
Finally paid off.
And it's been rewarded with a treasure trove of new material, what is essentially a total 16 new tracks, all dropped within the span of a few months. But I do think this album, this half overshadows the first half, personally. I think that Suffer in Hell was a really good taste, and then this is the full course.
I think it's a stronger album through from beginning to end, but I would be lying if I told you that I don't think that Suffer in Hell has 2 bigger highlights for me, just song specific, right?
You're talking in terms of singles?
Yeah. You had the song featuring Trevor, Rest in Peace from the Black Dahlia murder. And just at least the singles, they really stuck out to me and they really stuck with me personally. And this one, I actually think that, while I liked Sing to the Grave, singles leading up to this second part were I didn't Fathomless Maw just didn't really click the way that any of the singles off the first part did. So I kind of went into this and I was like, well, let's actually see what this one's going to all be about. So I think ultimately how I walked away from it, like I said earlier, was just that I think it's actually a stronger album.
I think it's reverse
But it
expectations,
doesn't-
honestly.
Yeah, I guess
I think the single sort of sets you up in a way that maybe the other tracks were slightly underwhelming on that first half. And then this time around, it's almost like the opposite case where it's like the two singles are maybe arguably not even close to the best songs on this half.
No, I look
so
at the
it's like
track
by
list.
virtue of comparison, like it ends up feeling like maybe significantly stronger.
But it's the same. It's actually sort of the same experience as that first album in the sense that, like, I look at this track listing and the two standout tracks for me are essentially Orc March and Yorm the Giant, because they're the fucking weird tracks on this album. The same way that it's like the two weird
By
tracks
virtue of name
on part
alone,
one. Right.
They're the strongest tracks on here. Orc March is just such a great fucking name for a deathcore song. Like, it feels like the kind of silly thing like early 80s power metal bands would have
it's-
named a track.
But they do such a great job. It's exactly that. But also, like, they live it, right? Because the atmosphere that they capture on this track makes you feel like you're sitting in there in one of the fucking old rundown kingdoms in the Lord of the Rings universe.
It's an audible representation of an Orc
Right.
March as if it were a real thing that you could like replicate.
And then Yorm the Giant. My understanding is that there's some Elden Ring references in some of this, at least lyrically or track listing wise, song titles. Sam, I don't know if you can confirm. or not.
Crazy the effect Elden Ring has had on the entirety of the scene. I'm not actually positive off the top of my head. Even though I have played and beat Elden Ring, let the record show. I don't know that I paid close enough attention that I picked up a character name like Yorm the Giant.
Yeah, I was going to say that one specifically is the one where I'm just like, well, what does that mean?
So here's why I think it's so good, honestly, for me, is that I think that Chelsea Grin continues to buck the trend of a lot of modern deathcore bands. And they seem to lean further into this sort of more experimental, chaotic side, as opposed to the more like structured orchestral stuff we're getting from a lot of other deathcore bands.
I was also going to say, how loud can we get other types of bands? You say buck the trend. I think realistically what they're doing is just their own thing, right? They're not trying to really replicate anyone else's sound or imitate anyone, mimic anyone's sound.
Definition
Yeah.
of bucking the trend.
Yeah. Well, I just really want to emphasize that.
There's just like a real chaos to what they do. And what's fascinating is I think the really only other point of comparison that I have for them currently is Darko. So it's interesting to think of the ways that like that side project has influenced this project.
Yeah.
But I think it's not just that. It's how well they manage it. Like, there's a real cohesion to this fucking chaos on here in a way that, like, no matter what aspect of the band is in the driver's seat, like everything else sort of like interconnects with it perfectly. So it's almost like you really have like this shifting spotlight on what the band wants to like really showcase in any given moment, and everything else will sort of like fall to the background, but it always like maintains this like perfect pace. Like everything on this album just really sings to one another, so that like as a unit, Chelsea Grin just sound like incredibly focused here. And I think that's where it really pays dividends, right? So like,
I sort of just on the topic of chaos, I think you're right. Like a lot of what you hear throughout the entirety of this album and on the last one is just, or actually maybe definitely more so this album is like, there is a focus on chaos, and I think for the most part it's contained chaos, but you're right, it's cohesive. But I think a really cool pattern I noticed, at least throughout maybe specifically the first half of this Suffer in Heaven LP, is that, man, 30 seconds left to go in this song, gloves are fucking off, and everyone just gets as absolutely insane as they want.
They know exactly when to like ratchet everything up. They know when to tone it back a little bit, and that makes for a really enjoyable like listen from start to finish, because an album like this, I feel like, really like dull the senses by the time it's finished, where after a while everything will just become noise, and I might be enjoying that noise, but like I need the little intricacies to maybe help highlight individual moments, and in that sense sort of give me like peaks and valleys throughout a record. And I think Chelsea Grin does that really masterfully here. And I think that while this is brutally heavy, like they flesh things out in a way that keeps it really exciting. The Path of Suffering is a really good example. There's a haunting little riff that flows throughout the entirety of that song, that stitches it together in a really great way. And there are a lot of little, almost like blink and you miss it, little fine tunings through each of these songs that like make them feel more fleshed out. They keep things interesting, and they show a band who's just like, they're not just heavy, they're also kind of fucking smart with it. And like, I really appreciate that. Like, this just feels like a project that has a lot of passion in it. Like there was a lot of time put in, like we just made sure that this product was as like perfectly baked before we took it out of the oven and gave it to everybody. And like, once again, I circle back to where we started. It just feels like Chelsea Grin has like really rewarded not just their fans, but like the deathcore community at large with a release like this.
No, I fully agree. I think that like for all the time that we've spent waiting on this band to drop new material, because again, like 2018, last time we heard from this band, only one album with Tom as their vocalist under their belt up until this point. And now we've got 2 extra ones, and it's just one of those things where you sit back and you really just appreciate the moment a little bit. And it was certainly the case with part 1, Suffer in Hell, and part 2, Suffer in Heaven. And as a fan, you just really have to sit back and appreciate it personally.
The one aspect of this, I really wonder if everything could have been perfect, is if we took these 2 albums and we really like got in the director's cut of what the perfect like deathcore album from this band could have been. Because I do look at this and I go, okay, if I cut like this one song and like I grab these few from like that other record and we shake up the track listing a little bit, is very good then perfect. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's like, I think for me this is like a strong 4 out of 5, where I think it's better than average, but I do have a slight like inkling in the back of my mind that perfect was somehow attainable, like if we hadn't quite experimented with the release structure the way we did. So it's like, I appreciate interesting. I like that we're willing to do something different in that sense. I wouldn't say that that's like taking away from my enjoyment, but it does leave like this question in my head of like an idealized version of this that could have been, right? Because it's like, okay, well, like 8 songs, maybe that's a little short, right? For both of these.
You're right. There's some reality in which a 10-track Suffer LP exists. And, you know, they could have taken a different approach where like 6 months later, sort of like similar to how Devil Wears Prada just did with Color Decay, say, hey, here's like 3 more tracks or whatever. Here's what was on the cutting room floor at the time. And like it could have just turned into like, hey, here's an incredible LP, like a perfect, flawless LP. And here's an incredible deluxe version of it. And sort of like we fall right in between with this, where it's just like, hey, here's a double album. It's not all perfect, but like when it is, holy shit.
Like you
no better band in this scene type of beat.
You got me thinking. You were like, you know, maybe you do make a strong point about like, I do enjoy this album better, but if I look at the Suffer in Hell, I think to myself, okay, but if we pulled like those singles into this, you know, and maybe we trimmed a song or two, there is something incredibly special here, you know?
Yeah.
What would you give this as your score?
I guess a 4 as well. Like I said earlier, like I think that there's definitely a subset of fans that are just waiting for us to really just not align on something, or for you to be like, this is a 5 for sure, and then just, or me give something a 1. And
Alternatively, I'm glad that you and I sort of line up on this one and that we both really sort of like enjoyed it overall.
Retroactively, what do you give Suffer in Hell? Because I think if this is a 4, then that makes that either a 3 or a 3.5.
I think it's a 3 for me. Like, I think it's an album that I really enjoyed, but didn't really like move the needle for me in terms of how I felt about the band. And this, alternatively, really pushes it over the top. Like, I think that this is where Chelsea Grin really knocked it out of the park.
I think to sort of emphasize some of what you said, personally, like I liked that last album, but I didn't go back to it in anticipation of this new one. I sort of just had a full idea, full picture of what it was. I feel like I'm not missing anything, and sometimes I feel like I would go back and do some homework with a band and re-listen to the last LP. And maybe it's just because it's only 6 months old, but like didn't feel the need to do it on this one. And I think that sort of speaks as to my general feelings with it, where it's like some of Chelsea Grin's greatest songs ever, and then like 4 or 5 other ones just don't really click. And then this one is maybe not my favorite singles out of this band, but a really great cohesive experience, like in totality.
I would be curious to listen to like the both albums back to back and see how maybe I feel about it, because that isn't an experience I've actually had yet.